UN News.
Many of you probably know this lady, but for those of you who don't, this is Julia I'm going to say her name wrong, and I lived in Uganda, so I apologize to my Ugandan family if you ever watch this. But her name is Julia Sebutinde. I guess that's how you say it. She is an ICJ judge who voted against essentially calling what's happening in Israel a plausible genocide.
Right.
We've spoken on her a few times on this show and we've talked about how, she has ties to a church that I'm very familiar with, that is basically run by Christian Zionists. Well, now she did an interview with, I guess, the Ugandan arm of the Monitor, where she's basically saying that the country has disowned her for her views on Israel, which, while I would guess it's true that they kind of disowned her, I don't think it's coming from. Basically, I think it's a whole lot of BS, and they're essentially throwing her under the bus.
Yeah.
And we'll get into why I think that later. But so as I said, you brought a lot of this stuff in for me in preparation for this story, so I appreciate that.
Right.
But you brought this in from Craig Bokiber, who said,
Mokber?
okay, probably.
Yeah.
In a new interview, Julia Sebutinde, the ICJ judge and Christian Zionist, who shocked the world by disregarding international law to defend Israel's genocide in Gaza, said, "We are in the end times." And we talked about that. I think Max Blumenthal did a article on the Gray Zone discussing that, just how her views kind of relate to the religious ideology of why she's pro-Israel. And the Lord is counting on me to stand on the side of Israel. So we're going to get into the article right now. So as I said, this is from the Monitor, I believe from the Ugandan arm of the magazine, where she said, she's in her fifis, and it's like, my country disowned me after Israel-Gaza ruling. It's written by Anthony Wesaka. So she said, I will never forget the day the judgment came out. Even though the government was against me, I remember one ambassador saying, ignore her because her ruling is not a representation of Uganda. And I believe I forgot who he is. I should have posted it, but I think I read a tweet of that ambassador that said that to her.
Like, why are you crying? Like, you are one person. You shouldn't be the voice of an entire country. Like, it makes sense to me again, for someone to be like,
right.
But that's
not it. For me. She's not. But that's not it. She's not. Yeah. And I'll get into why I believe that later. So, as I said, I believe they're throwing her under the bus, given the overwhelmingly dissent that the world has for Israel right now. But anyway, Justice Julia Sebutinde has criticized her homeland, Uganda, for joining the rest of the world in condemning her dissenting judgment in the Israel-Gaza genocide case. She made the ruling earlier this year at the International Court of Justice, where she serves. It was the first time the 71-year-old jurist had publicly addressed the intense criticism. There are now about 30 countries against Israel. The Lord is counting on me to stand on the side of Israel. The whole world was against Israel, including my country, Justice Sebutinde said on August 10th at Watoto Church during the launch of a new ministry for 8 members aged 55 and above, known as Golden Legacy, where she is a member. Keep that in mind regarding this church. We talked about this church before. We're going to refer to it again later. She added, I will never forget the day the judgment came out. Even though the government was against me, I remember one ambassador saying, ignore her because her ruling is not a representation of Uganda. The media ran this to fuel more anger and sentiment. Such such sentiments can only come from the pit of hell. Justice Sebutinde was the sole dissenting judge on the 17-member panel that earlier this year directed Israel to take urgent measures to prevent and punish direct incitement of the genocide and war in Gaza. Her stance drew widespread commendation, with accusation of plagiarism and bias allegedly linked to her perceived ties to Israel and Christian Zionist beliefs. Justice Sebutinde's ruling at the ICJ does not represent the position on the situation in Palestine. Uganda's permanent representative of the UN, Adona Adire, can you zoom in? Thank you, posted on X in January. Uganda's support for the plight of the Palestinian people has been expressed through our voting pattern at the United Nations, he added. A Kenyan user on X wrote, Judge Julia Sebutinde is such an embarrassment to our country and a disgrace to humanity. She didn't just vote against South Africa's petition, she voted against reason and morality, justice and freedom, love and compassion. She voted against the very soul of humanity. South Africa brought the case against Israel on December 29, 2024, accusing it of genocidal acts in its military operations in Gaza. When contacted yesterday, Mr. Vincent Bagire Wasa, the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said she made an independent decision that was being misconstrued to be a decision of Uganda. The comments were to make clear that her decision was independent. Speaking further, Judge Sebutinde revealed that around the time of the ruling, the ICJ was due to hold elections for his leadership, including the vice president's position, which she sought. She said that due to the uproar over her judgment, she almost withdrew from the race, but felt compelled by God to continue. A few days before the judgment, there were going to be leadership changes. I wanted to be the vice president. On the morning of the election, your peers elect you. I was feeling sick from worry and media coverage, so I decided to stay in bed. But God said, you coward, wake up. I got out of bed and went to work, she recalled. God.
This woman's hearing voices, Collin. What? Sorry.
She said a fellow judge later asked her why she thought she had been elected. I said no. He told me it was because of my character and the independence attested by my country. So whatever the devil had planned for me, God turned it around. This happened the day after the verdict, she told the congregation. Judge Sebutinde, now serving in the second and final 9-year term at the ICJ in the Netherlands, said the current crisis in Gaza was a sign of the end times foretold in the Bible, urging Christians to remain vigilant. There is something I want to share. I have a very strong conviction that we are in the end times. The signs are being shown in the Middle East. I want to be on the right side of history.
Well, too late for that.
I am convinced that time is running out. I would encourage you to follow developments in Israel. I am humbled that God has allowed me to be a part of the last days, she said. The end times refer to events leading up to the physical return of Jesus Christ as prophesied in the Bible. So actually, this is the clip that we mentioned her belief regarding the end times, where she goes into that further. But as I said, so we're going to do a little inception here. So we read this article from Max Blumenthal a few months ago, up to a year ago, where we talk more about her religious position in all of this, but also why I believe that Uganda, well, at least their leadership, is throwing her under the bus. So let's play the clip. I think it's about 3 minutes. And then we'll get into it more. Skinner's eschatological view of history clearly informs Sebutinde's dissent against the ICJ's ruling on South Africa's genocide case against Israel. Though Uganda's foreign ministry condemned her radical opinion, powerful evangelical figures inside the country with close ties to the presidency hailed her as a heroine. This is why I'm going back before, why I felt like. So as we said, and this was probably public, that there were, like, within the presidential circle, they were praising her for it. They were praising her for a vote. And again, living in Uganda, like, and I hate saying this in this way, but I wouldn't say there's a large Christian like presence in the country. There is, but it's large in the sense of, again, it's kind of what we see here, probably what you might equivocate to what you might see in terms of church, I would argue, in the South, possibly. Like, it's just a lot of literal interpretation of the Bible. Like, there's no nuance at all. You have to take the Bible for what it says. And especially given that the rise of Christianity, I would argue, has been due to a lot of white missionaries who are coming into the country. And I know that because once upon a time I was involved in a group like that. Not to say I don't regret it completely, because I've been able to have relationships with Ugandan people now that I'm able to speak outside of that. But that's how I came into, like, my relationship and my fondness for the country was through the church. So, so I'm able to say that on the based on what I've seen, that there is very little, like, I wouldn't say debate, but there's no discourse in terms of how the Bible should be interpreted, how it should relate to what is happening today, and basically the history around, again, the Bible was written by man, but the Bible was written, again, a lot of the Bible chapters, especially in the New Testament, especially if you look at Paul, were written as letters, and they were written as a way to be read out to a crowd. So there was definitely like a style of writing in order to appeal to a larger audience. But the idea is that, and especially like in those times, you would go into a group and talk through a lot of what Paul might have said, or maybe what an apostle might have read. We don't do that. It's just the idea of like, take your Bible for its word, listen to it literally, and move on with your day. So there isn't really enough at that discourse, that biblical discourse, which fortunately I was able to have because, as a theology major in college, and actually, funny enough, I was actually pretty lucky to go to a Catholic school where we were encouraged to do that. And that was, like, so, but they don't get that kind of discourse in Africa, in Uganda. I would argue they don't get that discourse in education system in general. It's very much like teacher or mentor or whoever gives you the information, you take it in and regurgitate it. So it's very much like that traditional education setup, which unfortunately is how the church system over there is set up. And many of these leaders, especially a lot of these larger churches that you might see in Kampala, especially, are led by white Westerners. So Watoto is one of those churches. So so it makes sense to me, knowing this church in particular, because I visited the church when I was there, why she thinks the way she thinks. And as I said, a lot of these churches are run by white people. And especially if white people here, especially with generally how, if you're a Christian Zionist, how pro-Israel you are, that would make sense in terms of our views. But going back to this, that was along the side. But as I said, presidential circles were actually praising her for how she voted. So let's go back into it to give more specifics of what we read from Max's article. Like a lot that was kind of a cover for what they really think. And Max pulled up, if you scroll up, just to read the name, because it's kind of small. So Patience M, and I'm going to pronounce, so I'm sorry, Rabiongo, I guess. so she tweeted. So she said on Instagram, you scroll down, not all heroes wear capes. Julia Sebutinde has made an historic stand at the ICJ. May God always remember her for mercy, and may Uganda as a nation always be found on the Lord's side. 2 prayer emojis and the Ugandan flag. So Patience is actually, if you zoom out, Patience happens to be the daughter of Yoweri Museveni, the Ugandan president. The flamboyantly evangelical president of Uganda, whose wife Janet, a close ally of Watoto Church, and fun fact, a lot of my mentors at the time at the ministry I worked at met her and liked her. So, that says something. Is known for her biblical interpretations of history. Frankie Aske, So I think that's enough, but you get the point. So, so the First Lady of Uganda also goes to this church.
Okay.
So for me, it's very hard to believe that they're throwing her under the bus. I think they might be throwing her under the bus publicly, given the backlash that, being supportive of Israel has gotten worldwide. But again, at least within that circle, they publicly praise her. And again, so someone like Janet, I would kind of call her like the Ugandan Michelle. Like, she has very high prestige in the country. She's very well liked. But as I said, more importantly, she also goes to this church. So you can tell, like, a lot of people who go to this church are very high up status-wise in Uganda. So the idea that allegedly these people are now saying to her, "You suck," I really do not believe at all, especially given the ties they have to this church. So I think they have a public. So it seems to me now they have a public position, trying to save face in the world discourse of people talking about Gaza, and especially given the genocide. But I'm very certain that they're still pretty pleased with her. But especially, I know her church is still pretty pleased with her of her vote. So really, this interview, really, I think she was up in her fees because people are like, "Oh, you suck," or whatever. But I don't think she really particularly cares, because she's getting the praise, I believe, from her congregation and these white missionaries who are probably very thankful for her for how she voted. So it comes off as just ingenuous to me that she's kind of complaining now that her country is essentially disowning her. And it honestly, given, like how I know Ugandans are taught, it wouldn't surprise me if more Ugandan, like on a probably do not know the extent of what's happening in Gaza, especially if they're not, because again, social media is not as prevalent among the working class. Hell, internet is not as prevalent among the working class in Uganda, depending,
Right.
So I haven't been there in a few years, so it's hard for me to say now how internet and internet connectivity is like over there now. But at least when I was there, not many people were up in the know what was happening in the international news. I'm sure among the youth it's definitely a thing. And I think, if anything, that's where the dissent might be coming from, might be from the youth. But I don't think, as far as the older generation in the country in particular, would necessarily be in opposition of how she thinks. I think, if anything, they might be more in favor of what she thinks. So I think any dissent she's getting might be from young people and not necessarily from older people that might not care that much, or if anything, might support her in her thinking. So that's kind of where I think that's just kind of like a whole lot of BS. So you brought this tweets. So this is from Zachary Foster as well, where he tweeted, "Did the Lord also tell her to plagiarize her legal opinions? As the biblical saying goes, those shall ensure one convinces the world of one's own intellectual and ethical bankruptcy." So this is from. So actually, this is from his blog, where he writes that she is a plagiarist. Now, I actually didn't look at this just to be very
I put that in. I should have went.
Do you have any
and looked?
Yeah, but do you have any information on this?
I don't, but I can go. I can go look it up real quick.
Okay. I should have looked it up too. But while you look it up, I'll read what Sam Husseini and Craig also tweeted. So Craig said in a new interview, well, we read that. So Sam said, in response to the tweet that we read earlier from Craig, said, "Christian, in quotation, Zionism is a global mega scam, not just in the US." And we've talked about how Christian Zionism is, I'll argue, more of an issue than it is as far as you are a Zionist and Jewish.
So in January 2024, Judge Sebutinde was the only judge of the 17 judges on the panel to vote against all 6 provisional measures in the genocide case brought by South Africa against Israel, including the order that Israel needed to take all measures within its power to prevent acts of genocide in Gaza. It was in her 36-page opinion on the legal status of Israel's occupation, however, published in July, where she plagiarized many sentences, including whole paragraphs. The legal opinion also includes lengthy historical discussions in which she got basic facts wrong and painted a distorted picture of the past. In fact, rather than citing historians and giving those historians credit for their work, Sebutinde plagiarized propagandists, themselves partisans, interested not in getting history right, but in defending the Zionist cause. So, and I'm just trying to look. So Sebutinde, prior to the establishment of British Mandatory Palestine, Palestinian Arabs viewed themselves as having a unified identity with the Arabs in the subregion until the 12th century. And that's like Jewish virtual library. Prior to partition, Palestinian Arabs did not view themselves as having a separate identity. So it's like she literally pulled stuff from these particular like libraries, and put them in her stuff.
Right, which I wouldn't be surprised given her church that they had directed her to do.
She also plagiarized PragerU.
Oh God.
Yeah. So
again, I wouldn't be surprised if her church pushed her to do that.
Plagiarized a blog post by Douglas J. Fife from the Hudson Institute.
Now, Hudson Institute.
Yeah,
hold on. So, what's significant about the Hudson Institute that would connect us in the space?
I know of the one guy, fucking Sagar's buddy.
What's his name? I call him Token, but that's not his name.
Yeah, no, it's the one who astroturfed for Israel. Yeah, I can't remember his name either.
Yeah, it's gonna come to me. But those of you know whose Sagas, I'm not sure if they're friends or at least that close anymore. But if you remember,
used to do a show together,
right? If you guys remember Saga, but I was thinking just of Saga because he's like the Hudson Institute guy that everyone in our space knows. So, but if you guys remember that black guy's name, it's gonna come to me at some point.
But here's Douglas J. Fife, who writes, Palestine applied vaguely to a region that for the 400 years before World War I was part of the Ottoman Empire. Sebutinde writes Palestine, like literally word for word, applied vaguely to a region. I mean, it's literally the same like punctuation and sentence structure. So, I mean, she just outright copy and pasted. So, but anyway, So I think I have this, right? So this is from Free Palestine TV. Esoteric end times fanaticism is driving all the Jewish and Christian Zionists ruling the West and its colonies. If you don't know that, you will not be able to understand why the genocide in Palestine continues, nor how to stop it before we end up in a nuclear holocaust. So, Husseini writes, it's kind of pathetic how so many are dwelling on this disgusting person when she really had no effect. What actually stopped the ICJ orders from being implemented was Algeria withdrawing the UNSCR to implement them, but they get a pass because rhetoric. If you don't know what I'm talking about, take a look at my writing, which we have in the past. So, but it is funny how that, like, you know, they use stuff like this to distract and like scapegoat. You know, it's like when they blame everything on Netanyahu, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, but I brought this, which I found talking about Christian Zionism in general, right? And how it came to the States. So figured it would be good for this, but here.
This story is a textbook example of how religion manipulates politics. There are millions and millions more Christian Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists.
Where does my support for Israel come from? Number one, because biblically we are commanded to support Israel.
We are commanded as Christians to support the government of Israel?
But how did Christian Zionism take a hold of America? It all started with a Bible called the Scofield Bible, written by a charlatan lawyer named Cyrus Scofield in 1909. Yes, written. See, what was unique about this Bible is that even though it contained the Word of God, as written in the King James Version, for the first time ever, a Bible now included notes.
So, just as a fact, King James Version is probably among the worst translations of the Bible you should read if you're going to read any version. It's the worst one. So, and funny enough, a lot of older churches still use it.
Yep.
Like my mother's church still uses it. So it's not to say you can't read it, but it's like it loses again, the King James Version was written during the time of Shakespeare. So there's a lot of nuance and a lot of things, especially in the translation, that are not translated correctly in that version, that is still kept in, and you're going to lose a lot of that nuance. So just to kind of give you that context, like the King James Version of the Bible is probably the worst translation that you should read, not to mention it's probably the hardest that you should read, especially just when normal people are not used to that language anyway.
You'll find this interesting.
Study guides and interpretations.
So this is so coming up in the Bible Belt South, myself, you would find kids with like, you know, kids editions of the Bible that have like what it really means and, you know, various interpretations, right? And like a lot of them come from these places like PragerU, like, you know, that include all this like Zionism in there, you know,
by the author himself. So within his notes, Scofield literally invented something called the Palestinian Covenant. And this covenant is Scofield's explanation of the verse Deuteronomy 30, where God guarantees and promises the land to the Jewish nation unconditionally. So this theory is based on something called dispensationalism, which was a very, very niche religious movement before Scofield came around. Now we know that Israel is just another name for the prophet Jacob, and he was given that name after he wrestled with God, because Israel means wrestled with God. But in the Scofield Bible, Scofield spreads this idea that Israel is a nation of God's chosen people where God has a distinct and separate plan for them. And that includes gathering Jewish people as a whole to Palestine in order to usher in the end of times and the second coming of Jesus. At that point, something called the rapture happens, where Jesus secretly comes and all of a sudden all the Christians are in a rapture and go up to the sky. And what will happen to the Jewish people down below? Well, unfortunately, 2/3 of them will perish. Completely invented. No other Bible mentions this. And of course, nowadays, they call it the land covenant because they don't want to say Palestinian covenant because they don't want to even acknowledge that there's such a thing as Palestine. Now, why did Schofield, an alcoholic charlatan lawyer who went to jail for fraud, write a whole Bible? How did he fund publishing it with no wealth? Who funded Schofield's multiple trips to Europe for research? There are many theories about how this originated, including the fact that Schofield was a part of the Lotus Club, where prominent American Zionist and lawyer Samuel Untermyer also frequented, and that he used Schofield as a useful tool in order to spread Zionism in America. We may never know for sure what the origins of this whole project was, but it is very clear how it concluded. The mass influence on America that this Bible had to support the current colonial state of Israel is a matter of biblical prophecy. Free Palestine.
So, I've been looking.
How is it is always the atheists, allegedly?
Don't blame that on us. It's not us.
Not you, but but I would argue it's the most effective in spreading religious ideology, even though it's so wrong. How is that?
I had the discussion with Indy after looking for like skeptical stuff on something completely different, right? And ended up finding this channel that was, atheist, whatever, where it was all like pro-Israeli like stuff. And it led me to thinking about like how the atheist community, especially the celebrity atheist community, have like, they do not touch Judaism at all. Like, which Hitchens is the only one I think I saw ever mention it. And it was like once, right? But we've, there was Dawkins got called out not that long ago and said some terrible shit. Stephen Fry. I mean, like you don't see Gervais or it used to be Russell Brand was part of this. Now he's not because of reasons. He done found Jeebus. Mainly to make sure he doesn't get sexual allegations completely tied to him. But like, I just find it, I think clearly that community has like avoided it and has been told to like, hey, don't touch this particular religion. And there's like, they've definitely talked about Islam, ad nauseum, right? They've talked about Christianity ad nauseum, but somehow Judaism gets a pass. And I'm one for going like all of the above, Like, and I don't even care about your little niche local religions either. They're not accurate either. Sorry. Like, I get in my bag about it because I just find it fucking baffling why we continue to need this as a society. But, like, I think the world is pretty marvelous enough without having magical fairy tales try to explain it. Myself personally, but yeah, I do find it funny how they've completely avoided the Zionist topic as far as Jewish faith is concerned,
Because I think my fear on that is because if they do mention it, then they have to admit that they're wrong.
Yeah.
And they have to essentially reform, or like not reform, but you know what I mean. Like,
yeah.
They have to repent. Even with that, but like they have to account. That's the word. They have to account for what's happening in Gaza. So, and they have to account for the history that led to this, which they don't want to do. So, it's a form of denial that I think that's the thing that makes me the most infuriating, because the history is there. So, but you're choosing to ignore it. over
it's
this
just
belief that
these are supposed to be people that are massively skeptical of this kind of stuff. That's what I don't get. Like, you know, you can see through Peter Popoff, but you can't see through Daniela Weiss. Like, you can't see, you know what I mean? Like, it's the same kind of bullshit, you know, and it's the same kind of religious manipulation. Yet somehow, like, they ignore it. It baffles me. You know, this is a person who had found Kyle Kalinske because he was secular talk. And I'm still waiting for the atheist community to, like, step up on this, and they're just not, you know, which I find funny. But anyway, any closing thoughts before we get out of here? Fairy tale fucking end time shit.
Yeah,
causing nonsense
as I said,
again.
I basically believe they're throwing Sebutinde under the bus because of the blowback, but I think they're fans of her, and still,
Right.
in terms of what she did. And again, as I think if she's getting blowback from in Uganda, it's from the youth, who are probably more wired to what's happening. Yeah, and I'm always saying that because when it came to George Floyd, like, they were my Ugandan family who are young were the first people, even before y'all kind of checked in on me. It was them who came to me first and asked me, "Are you okay, uncle?" I was like, "Yeah." And I asked them, "How did you know?" And they said, "Oh, we saw online." So my guess is Ugandan youth are seeing what we see and are sickened by it, versus the older generation. And I will argue the older generation will be more into religion in that way, are probably, either they are not fully aware because they're probably not as online as much, or they kind of align with what September thinks, especially if they are in the church. And
you could outlaw religion and most of these sex crimes would disappear in a couple of generations, but we don't have time for rational solutions.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where I believe the dissent is coming from, but I don't think it's like an overwhelming outrage in the country in general. So I do want to kind of preface with that nuance there. Again, I could be wrong, but I would guess I'm probably more on the, given what I saw and experienced when I was living there.
Yep.
But talking about stories like these are why we are demonetized. So if you want to support us financially in order to keep the lights on the network and on the show, if you have a smartphone, if you're not using it right now to watch us, you can scan the QR code that you see on your screen, or you can type in the Ko-fi link that you see at the bottom of your screen to donate. Or if you're in the YouTube chat, you can type in !donate, all one word, and the link will pop up and you can donate right there directly. You can also donate via PayPal, Cash App, and Substack if you want to give there as well. All those links to those donation links are in the description below. And like we always say, we know that times are tough and we don't expect your money. Just being here is gift enough. But if you want to support us in order to help us grow, the best way and the free way to do that is by liking, subbing, and sharing our content. And let us know in the comments what you think. Do you believe that Uganda is really disowning Sebutinde, or is she really just kind of in her fifis, just in terms of, some of the blowback that she's getting from her countrymen, even though I personally believe it's not as widespread as this article or what she is making it out to be. And what's your opinion as far as Christian Zionism, I would argue in a lot of ways has influenced what's happening in Gaza? Let us know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.